Welcome to Legal Lines. My name is D.O'Shea. I'm the host of this program, which is brought to you by the York County Bar Foundation. Today, my guest is attorney Laura Smith. Laura is an attorney with MPL Law Firm here in York, Pennsylvania, and the topic is immigration law. So welcome, Laura.
Thanks.
And you are an attorney who does some immigration law.
I am.
And we're going to be talking about several things concerning immigration law. I know immigration law has been in the news a lot lately. I know that there are some bills that are being talked about in Congress, and I know it's a very political subject, but we don't get into politics here. We're not going to talk about the politics of immigration law. We're not going to talk about pros and cons of changing the law. We're going to talk about how immigration law is right now and how it affects people right now and what you as an attorney can do in the area of immigration law. Is that fair enough?
That's fair.
Okay. I'm sure you have your own opinions on what's happening in the field of immigration law, and we'll try to stay away from the politics of it. But at any rate, there are some terms that go on in immigration law that I'd like to start with, and then we can move on to how an attorney can help someone with immigration law. Okay?
Sure.
And the very first term I think we all know, and that is a citizen. And what is a citizen?
What is a citizen? You're a citizen if you were born in this country or you naturalized, which means the process of gaining citizenship from formerly being a legal permanent resident.
Okay. And when you become a citizen, it gives you the rights of voting and everything else that a U.S. citizen would have the right to do.
Exactly.
Okay. And you used the term, what, permanent resident?
Legal permanent resident.
All right. Now, that's a different status, correct?
Yes.
And what is a legal permanent resident?
It's someone who can legally reside here. Most all of the rights of a citizen, but you don't get to vote. You know, there's different rights. What happens, different constitutional rights. You're not protected by the U.S. Constitution if you commit a crime. So just different rights apply to you. Okay,
so a legal permanent resident is someone who is here basically legally.
Yes.
When we hear people who are here illegally, so there's some type of formal procedure that someone goes through to get legal status.
Yes.
And what is that formal procedure?
Well, it depends on a lot of different things, but maybe we can use an example to explain that. If you're here by family, that means that someone in your family petitioned, whether it's a spouse, a parent, a child, someone petitioned for you to get a visa, and then because of the petitioning U.S. citizen or legal residence, right to be here, you then have a right to be here as well. So that's how you would gain legal permanent residence.
Okay.
And the other thing to probably point out is the much more common term for a legal permanent resident is a, quote, green card holder.
Okay. Now, you told me something interesting before the program began, and that is green cards are not green.
They're no longer green.
And I didn't know that.
They used to be green, yes.
But the term is still used, a green card. And what is a green card?
A green card is basically the document that kind of proves that that does prove that you have that status as a permanent resident.
And someone with a green card would be able to be legally employed in the United States. Is that correct?
Yes, generally. I mean, there's different ways of getting employment status that you wouldn't necessarily have legal permanent residence. But most legal permanent residents also have employment status.
So there are people who can be legally employed in the United States who are neither citizens nor permanent residents. Is that correct?
That is correct. You want an example?
Okay, yes.
An example would be if someone was granted a relief, say withholding of removal, and they had a fear of going back to their country that was recognized by an immigration judge. Well, what that really means is that you can't be here, but we're not going to remove you until it's safe for you to go there. So you can be here, work here. You don't have status. You're not a legal permanent resident, but you can work here.
Is there a terminology for that type of status?
You're given a document where you apply for an I-765, which is actually your employment authorization. No one goes around carrying their piece of paper, but that's technically what you get. I don't think that there's another term.
Okay, but I think what you're getting at when you're talking about this form is a great deal of immigration law is very bureaucratic.
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's very fair to say.
And this bureaucracy is something set up by the federal government.
Yes.
Correct? And the states really have very little say in this. Is that also fair to say?
Well, without getting into politics in states like
Arizona,
yes.
Okay.
Theoretically, under the Constitution, immigration is a federal government, allotted to the federal government to basically regulate.
All right. And with respect to that, the court system for the immigration courts, you mentioned the immigration judge before.
Yes.
That is a federal court system, correct?
That's a federal administrative court.
All right. So an administrative court is slightly different than a trial court. Is that the correct terminology?
Yes, I feel like I'm going back to law school.
All right. Well,
but I hope to say this correctly, but there's certain courts that are essentially set up by the Constitution, says these are the courts that will exist, and then an administrative court is set up more through the executive branch to oversee a policy or a law that's promulgated by the legislative branch.
so immigration courts are administrative in nature.
They are.
Another example of administrative court would be something for like Social Security would be
The bankruptcy
an administrative
court.
Bankruptcy court. So there are other administrative courts.
Oh, there's lots of administrative
several
courts.
of them, as a matter of fact. But the federal court system, I think, for those of you who don't know, York County has an immigration court here, correct?
It does.
And where is that located?
It's located at the York County Prison. And it's interesting because if you go down the list of cities that have immigration courts, you're looking at Boston, Baltimore, San Francisco. York kind of doesn't fit in, so it's unique that we have an immigration court in York.
Okay, and that's been here roughly 20 years, am I correct?
Yeah.
So, and how many administrative judges are here in York?
There's 2 full-time, and I believe there's 1 part-time, possibly full-time.
Okay, so for a relatively small county, we have quite a bit of immigration law in this area.
Yes.
Is that fair to say? And also, while we're talking about the different categories or terminologies, undocumented, what that just means someone who is here with no documents to say that they are legally here. Is that fair to say?
That's a fair way to say it, yes.
Okay. Sometimes they're called illegals.
Yes.
And basically, when we talk about immigration law, the goal for the immigrant is to not be an illegal.
Right.
Illegal is subject to deportation, which you told me before the program now has a different term.
Has a nicer name. It's called removal now.
Removal. No one
Yeah.
uses deportation anymore.
Everyone uses deportation except for the immigration court and the law.
So it's the politically correct term
Yeah.
is removal. Okay, which basically means you're removed from this country and sent back to another country.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in dealing with immigration law, what does an attorney who handles immigration cases typically have to deal with?
Oh.
Very open question.
Yeah, it is. And this is where I talked to you before the program. I kind of separate immigration law in my mind into 3 categories because, typically I can funnel all the calls that I get into my office into 3 categories. One is employment-based, which, that would be a U.S. employer who has an employment need and can't fill that with a U.S. citizen. The second would be family. That's, someone who wants to bring their spouse, their spouse's children. And then the third is someone who's already here and is facing a removal situation.
Okay. And when we talk about family, okay, we're talking about someone who who is a legal, either a citizen or has legal status here as a permanent legal resident, who wants to bring a family member over.
Yes.
And have the family member stay here. Are there certain preferences with respect to family members?
There's a hierarchy. I don't have it memorized exactly. The easiest way to get here is through a spouse or a fiance. There's essentially, we say in immigration law, there's no waiting line. Versus if the worst case scenario is if you want to bring a sibling, a sister, brother from a country, that has a lot of immigration problems. I think Mexico, the Philippines is one. It could be up to a 20-year wait for a visa to become available. But for a spouse and a fiance, there's always a visa available.
Okay, so if someone were to marry a non-citizen, you're saying that the waiting time period to bring the non-citizen to the country is very quick?
Yes. Well, I will say from my perspective, it's quick. From their perspective, it won't be quick because you still have to fill out the paperwork. You have a procedure to go through, which can feel like it takes a long time, but versus some of the other family hierarchy situations.
Well, what would be the time frame?
I filed a fiancé visa in November that was just granted last week.
So that's about 6 months?
6 months, yes.
Now that was a fiancé. Is there a difference between a fiancé and a spouse?
Well,
if they're already married.
They're already married. Theoretically, most of the time those people are already here, and you're dealing with a situation where you have to cure a immigration problem, I guess, because they came here on a visitor visa. So
there's a different status for someone who is here and gets married as someone who's married in a foreign country and then wishes to bring the spouse into the United States.
There's a different, I probably wouldn't get involved in that until they were here and wanted to what's called adjust their status from a visa holder to that of legal permanent resident, because if you're married and your spouse is still a citizen, you're theoretically supposed to go through the consulate in that country, get the visa, then come here.
Okay. One of the things when we're talking about the illegal status is that this is not just somebody who jumps the border or sneaks into the country illegally. Many of the people who are considered illegal came here by legal means.
Exactly.
They basically were tourists. Mm-hmm. They came into the country for
students a lot.
Or students. They came in for a specific reason, for a limited amount of time, and outstayed the amount of time that they were supposed to stay here. Mm-hmm. And some of those people become part of society. They meet other people. They fall in love. They get married. And now they're here, but they basically were considered illegal. And when they get married to someone here, although they might not get legal status right away, no one's going to send them back to another country.
Well, it depends.
Oh, it depends.
It depends.
I mean, didn't know that.
It's actually, and that's kind of what happens. I would say at a certain level, the laws really haven't evolved with the type of world we live in. You know, we have the internet, we have Facebook. You can meet someone from anywhere around the world very easily, and that gets a lot of people in trouble because you think, well, I just want to marry someone. This should be no big deal. Well, you still have to follow the procedure. Where that could be a big deal in the case you were talking about is if someone had even this is what I would consider minor, but if they had some sort of criminal conviction, like even a DUI or something in their past in their home country, you know, they'd have to apply for what's called a waiver of inadmissibility. So, you know, it's not always that easy, you know.
Depends on the background of the person.
Depends on the background of the person and the nature of their overstay.
Because the background is researched, then we're looking at a bureaucratic system that might take months to research it. Mm-hmm. So is it fair to say that a good immigration lawyer could help cut through the bureaucracy?
Well, I think that the immigration lawyer is going to help you prepare your paperwork so you're feeding them what they want to see. I can't speed up, you know. I could call them 5 times a day and they're not going to speed up the process for me.
Well, we're going to stop right here and take a break. We'll be back in a few moments. This is Legal Lines. My guest is Laura Smith. The topic is immigration law. Welcome back to Legal Lines. My name is D.O'Shea, the host of this program. My guest today is attorney Laura Smith with the law firm of MPL Law Firm. And we're speaking about immigration law. And right before the break, we were talking about various practice areas for the law practice as far as immigration cases are concerned. And we were talking about people coming into this country and gaining legal status by virtue of family members being here. We spoke mainly about a spouse, someone who marries someone who's not a citizen, and how to bring the spouse into the country for legal status. And let's talk about other family members now.
Okay. One of the big kind of, and it affects a large number of people that I didn't mention when you talk about spouse, they're what are called derivative beneficiaries. So if your fiance has children under the age of 18, they can get what's called derivative status, and that actually applies to a large number of people who are here.
So in other words, if you had a spouse who was previously married, had children, the spouse doesn't have to make a choice of staying in the foreign country or leaving the children or marrying the person who's here.
Yes, as long as they're under 18, you get derivative status.
Okay. All right. Well, what about other family members?
So you can apply for, if you're a legal permanent resident or a U.S. citizen, you can apply for a parent. So say, you're not under 18 and you want to apply for a parent, you can apply for a child who's over 18, a sister or brother. You can apply for a grandparent or a grandchild or a niece or a nephew.
Okay, so there's a certain proximity to the relationship.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with like an aunt who is raising a child will be treated like...
No, and those are the hard cases.
They're the hard cases.
Yeah, that they're not... I mean, it's a very bureaucratic system, like you said, so you occasionally get those calls, and there's really not a lot you can do there, and it's unfortunate because, this is what the law says, so there's not a lot of room for interpretation, unfortunately.
Okay. Let's switch from family members to work visas.
Okay.
I mean, there's a way to get immigration status due to the nature of your employment. Is that correct?
Yes.
And can you explain that?
I can. Where to start? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that there's a small number of work visas available. I think, for specialty workers or someone who has the equivalent of college degree, there's less than 100,000 per year. So, and the other thing to keep in mind is that, when your employer files for you, they have to go through the Department of Labor and essentially say that they're not that the visa holder is not going to displace a United States worker. So that's the process. That's what takes so long.
By a specialty employment, you're talking mainly about professional type individuals.
Yeah.
Would that be physicians, engineers?
Exactly. Computer science, 4-year degree.
Faculty at universities?
There's actually an unlimited amount of visa for education faculty.
Oh, well, is there? Okay.
Yeah. But yes, exactly. I mean, one area I know personally is because my father's a pharmacist, and about 10 years ago there was a major crisis in the U.S. There wasn't enough pharmacists, so a lot of the big companies applied for a lot of visas at that time. That's just one example.
You said there's a limited number. If there's a great need for individuals in a chosen field, does that number change from year to year?
No. So it's a race to get there. It's a race to who can file first. And
the number's 100,000 a year?
Roughly. I think it's for the professional ones, it's actually 65,000, another 20,000 for a master's degree.
So there are different
levels.
Categories.
Yeah, there really is. It's a hard thing to say, but it's definitely a professional visa.
Okay, but it's basically professionals that are needed.
Yes.
And they have to be some type of certification that they would not displace a U.S. citizen who's in the same profession.
So as the attorney who's petitioning, I'll help the client, come up with what they submit to the Department of Labor that proves to the Department of Labor that you're not displacing American workers.
Okay, well, wouldn't some of this I don't know how that would be done. I'm sure it's all bureaucratic, but let's say that a company that needs an engineer might have some individual that they really want to hire because they have a unique specialty, and there might be 10 other people who don't have that specialty or who are U.S. citizens. Would that company still have the right to pick the person they want because of the specialty?
It comes down to, a lot of it has to do with how you advertise the position. So you're right. If you don't do that process correctly and you're an engineering firm and you just say, I want an engineer, the Department of Labor might not certify that because you're like, well, there's 50 engineers who could apply to that. But if you write the description as, I want an engineer who has experience in, I don't know, XYZ computer programs or building this type of bridges, you have to limit it to sort of tailor the position.
Okay. And this is something that's just limited by the number each year, and as I understand it from our discussion before the show, this is sort of first come, first serve.
Mm-hmm.
So once a year they open up the application process, and as soon as they reach the number, the process closes, no matter how great the need might be for the certain professional.
Right.
Okay. And there are probably ways to get around that. No?
No. I mean, there's a certain, I think if they get more, there's a lottery system. So.
Okay.
They change. Now, I'm saying 65 because that's the number I looked up for, a particular year. It might not be 2013. I mean, they do fluctuate every year, so it's not set in stone, that number.
Okay. But now we're talking about, this is the category that you referred to as specialty occupations?
Yes.
And there's, what about the other occupations? I think it's called non-skilled positions?
Right. It's a different type of visa. And, I mean, the process is the same, except for the biggest difference is that the visa is a shorter term visa, so the person can't stay. It's supposed to fill a temporary gap.
I see. Well, what about the specialty occupations? Is there a term to that? In other words, is it limited to a number of years, or? Oh,
yes. It's for 3 years, and it can be renewed once. And there's actually a pathway to permanent residence there if the employer can further, after the visa, you go through the application process, and there's still a need. That's how you get here as a doctor and get the permanent residence.
Right. As you speak, it
all comes clearer.
It sounds more complicated to me, quite frankly. It sounds more bureaucratic. So I just assumed, and I'm hearing incorrectly, that if you qualified for a work visa, you became a legal permanent resident. But that's not the case.
No.
Okay, that's just the first step to become a legal permanent resident.
If you have that particular type of visa, work visa, that will allow you to, it's called perm processing, is the legal lingo.
So that brings someone in faster in order to fulfill the need in that occupation than it would be to apply for a regular permanent legal resident. Is that?
Well, there's no such thing as you have to have some sort of connection to this country. I can't be a French citizen who just happens to like the United States, who has no job here, who has no family here. There's no avenue for me to say I'd like to be a citizen. So.
Okay, so that I didn't know either.
Yeah, I mean
I
it's
think
very
back to
limited.
when my grandparents came here and they just got on the boat and they came to the United States with no skills or anything and wound up at Ellis Island and made their way. And that story cannot go on now. Is that what you're saying? You have to have a connection.
Yes, the nexus.
Either connection is the
family
or
employment. Yes.
Okay, and basically that's the main two ways
with a certain
to get status.
Caveat that there's a few diversity lottery visas every year, but by and large, yes.
And there's also the whole system of political asylum.
Right.
And that's someone who is being persecuted or discriminated against in a foreign country to the level where we believe that it would be only fair to that person leave that country.
Right, and they have to prove, that's actually the area I'm least familiar with because, I don't get a lot of those cases, but I can describe it akin to what it is on the way out, which is called withholding of removal. So, and typically that has to be based on something you can't control. So maybe that's not the proper way to say it, but something about your race, religion, your membership in a political group where you would...
So it could be your political beliefs as
right.
well.
Mm-hmm.
That in a country that doesn't allow freedom of expression, for example.
Exactly.
And we can grant asylum. And those cases make a lot of news, but they're not the types of cases that you deal with practicing law in your county where we're dealing with the immigration court here. Is that...
Well, first of all, normally those come up when you're entering the country. So you literally be stopped at an airport, a port somewhere. So York County is not a port. And the other thing is, the withholding we do, but quite frankly, those are more the cases you get for pro bono, because obviously those people don't tend to have a lot of, means a lot of times.
Right.
But, I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is when you just can't come and say, I'm part of this political party. You have to have a well-founded fear of persecution, torture, something that's going to very bad happen to you if you go back, not just, for lack of, I'm not a Democrat or Republican in this country and I don't like the other party. You have to have a fear of torture, persecution, and be able to prove that. That's essentially what asylum is.
Okay. One of the things we talked about prior to the program was something that's called DACA, D-A-C-A. Can you tell us what that is?
That stands for DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
Okay. Now, without getting political, this is sometimes referred to as the DREAM Act.
Right, which actually was a bipartisan measure, so I don't have to be political.
Okay, good. And the DREAM Act, as you pointed out to me before the program, never was enacted, so it's not the DREAM Act.
Right.
But the DREAM Act, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a program that was designed for children that were brought into the country by their parents, typically, and they have grown up pretty much as American citizens, went to U.S. schools, etc., but they technically are not citizens because they were born in another country. They were brought here when they were too young to make up their own mind as to where they wanted to live, and now they're here, and there's a big issue. Do these people just get removed, which is the new term for deported?
Right.
Okay? And the idea of this is that such people will not be removed from this country if they were brought here at a very young age. And what is that age?
It had to be before you were 17.
Okay,
so before you were an adult.
All right.
Legal adult.
Now, as I understand it, this is an executive order that's in place right now.
Yes.
So if you can prove that you were brought to this country by your parents or by another adult, for that matter, before you were 17, you will not be subject to a removal or deportation.
Yeah, there's a list of requirements. You have to be under a certain age. I don't know them all, but you have to prove you were here for 5 years is another.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And yes, basically the government, it's a hard thing to counsel someone as an immigration lawyer because there's not a lot of surety. It is an executive order. Basically all the government is saying is for now,
that's the problem with an executive order, if I understand
yeah.
it, is that the law can change and they can remove it. It's unlike the DREAM Act. If it had been established as law, then it would be the law and it would move forward as the law, and then they would be able to know that this is a permanent arrangement at least. Right.
So it's very hard to counsel someone because it's a temporary deal. You come forward, you come out from behind the scenes. And
well, it's an interesting area that we'll just have to follow, but right now we are out of time. Again, this was Legal Lines. My guest was attorney Laura Smith. Our topic was immigration law. Thank you for joining us.